The transition from controlled flight to catastrophic structural disassembly occurs at the intersection of velocity, visibility, and granite. On December 5, 1942, a North American B-25C Mitchell bomber, serial number 41-12907, entered the Owen Stanley Range in New Guinea. It carried a crew of 7 and a full payload of ordnance intended for Japanese positions at Buna. It did not reach the target. Instead, it collided with the jungle floor at high speed, initiating a recovery timeline that would stretch for nearly 7 decades. The aircraft, known to its crew as the Happy Legend, faced a set of operational constraints common to the New Guinea campaign but lethal in combination. The primary variable was the terrain. The Owen Stanley Range rises sharply from the coastal plain, creating a physical wall that aircraft must climb over or thread through via narrow corridors like the Kokoda Gap. The second variable was the atmosphere. In this region, cloud cover creates a condition known technically as instrument meteorological conditions. When a pilot enters instrument conditions, the natural horizon line vanishes. The vestibular system in the human ear becomes unreliable, and without a visual reference, a pilot can no longer feel the difference between level flight and a slow, fatal bank. From that moment, the aircraft must be flown by the gyroscopes on the panel alone. If First Lieutenant Wilson L. Pinkstaff entered cloud without a reliable sightline on the ridge, the margin for error shrank to a razor-thin band, and the cockpit became a place where perception could no longer be trusted. The collision was not a glancing blow. It was a high-energy strike that tore the airframe open and punched into the jungle floor. The nose and bomb bay hit first, and the violence of that moment did not spread outward into a wide debris field. It drove downward. Visitors later spoke of a crater on the order of 50 feet across, with water eventually standing deep at its center. But the more important fact is what that crater did next. It became a trap. In a high rainfall zone, the depression filled with rainwater and groundwater, and runoff carried sediment into the bowl. The primary wreckage slid below the surface and disappeared under a growing layer of silt, sealed away from air and interference. The first attempt to assess the loss occurred only months later. In February 1943, Australian ground troops patrolling the area located the impact site. They confirmed the presence of the wreckage but were bound by immediate tactical constraints. The location was close to active enemy lines. A recovery operation would require heavy equipment, time, and noise discipline, none of which were available to a patrol in contested territory. They reported the find, and records indicate they buried at least one crew member nearby, while the remaining men were left unrecovered at the water-filled crater. This initiated an intermittent, limited effort that stretched across decades. The site was known, but it was physically hostile to standard recovery methods. In 1961, a Royal Australian Air Force team revisited the location. They found the crater still full of water. Without the pumping and logistical support needed to control that water and reach what lay beneath the sediment, they could recover only minor surface debris, not the crew compartment. The water acted as a barrier, protecting the site from looting but preventing repatriation. The core problem for any recovery team was the geometry of the loss. This was not a surface scatter where components could be mapped across the jungle floor. It was a submerged excavation, an impact bowl that captured the heavy parts of the aircraft, held them underwater, and then buried them under sediment. To reach the crew, an engineering team would have to remove vast quantities of water and suspended mud on a remote mountain ridge, while filtering that material for evidence and managing the risk of unexploded ordnance that may have helped create the hole in the first place. For 67 years, the crew of the Happy Legend remained listed as missing in action, not because the site was unknown, but because it was engineered by physics to resist access. The crash created a preservation vault. The problem was that the key required industrial capability that did not arrive until the 21st century. The search for the crew of the B-25 begins with a specific set of physical dimensions. The impact crater measures 50 feet in diameter. At its center, the water stands 13 feet deep, covering a layer of sediment that extends even deeper into the mountain soil. This geometry is the defining constraint of the site. It is not merely a debris field where components are scattered across the jungle floor. It is a geological vessel that captured the aircraft and then sealed it away from the atmosphere. To understand why the wreckage exists in this state, we have to examine the mechanics of the loss. The aircraft arrived with mass, speed, and a mission load that turned impact into excavation. The kinetic energy of a bomber at cruising speed is already enough to shred structure on contact. But here, the force did not stop at the skin and frames. The strike delivered energy into the ground so abruptly that the airframe failed instantly, and the event behaved less like a crash than like a violent ground-coupled detonation. The result was not simply a broken fuselage, it was Earth displaced on a massive scale, a bowl carved into the ridge that swallowed what remained. This brings us to the concept of impact crater dynamics. In a typical low-angle crash, an aircraft might skid, shedding energy over hundreds of yards, leaving a linear trail of debris. In a high-angle, high-energy impact with ordnance, the energy is released into the ground. The soil acts as a fluid under this instantaneous pressure, flowing outward to create the crater lips before settling back. The aircraft components, including the heavy engines and the crew compartment, are driven to the lowest point of this excavation. They are then buried by the fallback of displaced soil. In the Owen Stanley Range, a crater does not remain empty. The region takes heavy rainfall, and the depression filled quickly. What followed was not mystery, but hydraulics. Water stood over the wreckage, and every storm carried more soil downhill. Sediment stayed in suspension, then settled, building a thick mud cap over the lowest point of the bowl. That cap did the real work. It cut the wreckage off from the atmosphere and rewrote the chemistry of the site. Most aircraft wrecks in New Guinea are subject to aerobic decay, the familiar surface fate of metal and tissue in a hot, wet jungle. Exposed wreckage cycles through wetting and drying, corrosion accelerates, and biology disappears on a human timescale. That is the normal rule in this theater. The crater of the B-25 broke it. The crater of the B-25 created a condition known as anaerobic preservation. Once the wreckage was submerged and buried in the silt, it was cut off from the oxygen supply in the atmosphere. The water in the crater became stagnant. The bacteria that drive rapid decomposition require oxygen to function. In the oxygen-starved mud at the bottom of the crater, these biological processes slowed to a nearer halt. This environment acts as a time capsule. Materials that would normally vanish remain intact. Paint applied to the aluminum skin in 1942 retains its pigment because oxidation cannot occur. Leather flight gear, paper documents, and human tissue are protected from the aggressive biological recycling of the jungle. This phenomenon is often seen in maritime archaeology, where shipwrecks in deep, anoxic waters preserve wood and cloth for centuries. Here, it occurred at an altitude of thousands of feet in a tropical mountain range. The consequence for the recovery team is a paradox. The same environment that prevented the identification of the crew for decades is the only reason the evidence still exists. If the aircraft had crashed on a slope and remained on the surface, the biological remains would have been lost to the elements long ago. Because they were driven into the mud and covered by water, they waited in a state of suspended animation. However, this preservation comes at a cost. The evidence is not accessible. It is suspended in a slurry of mud and water, invisible from the surface. A surveyor standing at the edge of the crater sees only a dark pool. There is no way to visually inspect the wreckage without draining the vessel. The team cannot simply walk in and map the site. They must dismantle the trap that physics created. This means the water must be removed and the mud must be processed, all while maintaining the anaerobic conditions as long as possible to prevent sudden degradation of the artifacts upon exposure to the air. This specific geometry creates the primary operational challenge. The recovery requires heavy industrial intervention in a location that is difficult to reach by foot. The team must verify what lies at the bottom of the 13-foot pool, but they cannot do so until they control the environment. The mud holds the answer, but the mud also hides the hazards that survived the impact along with the crew. The modern forensic mission relies on a measured grid, an imposed geometry that turns the crater into an addressable space. When the recovery team, working under the U.S. Army Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, CILHI, later JPAC, now DPAA, arrived in the Owen Stanley Range to reclaim the crew of the B-25, they did not attack the mud blindly. They mapped the bowl, divided it into squares, and recorded the three-dimensional position of every artifact, bone fragment, and piece of wreckage. The method preserves context, not just objects, converting a chaotic whole into a dataset ready for what came next. However, the timeline of modern recovery unfolded in stages. By 2001, a major effort finally began to recover remains from the crater. In the follow-on push in 2002, the team's careful order met a hazard that overruled the mandate for recovery: the aircraft's payload. The B-25 had struck with a full bomb bay, and not all of the ordnance had detonated. Investigators reported unexploded items, including at least one device described in the 500-pound class. After decades of impact damage and corrosion, the fusing and internal components were no longer predictable. That uncertainty forced an exclusion zone and turned excavation into a safety problem first. In a confined crater, far from reliable evacuation and specialist support, there is no allowable margin for error. With no way to render the hazard safe in the moment, the risk could not be mitigated with the equipment on hand. Consequently, in 2002, the operation was suspended. The team leader made the decision to halt the excavation and withdraw from the site. This was a calculated retreat driven by the physics of the explosive hazard. The grid was secured, the location was documented, and the team evacuated. The crater returned to silence. This interruption underscores the complexity of retrieving the crew of the Happy Legend. It was not enough to find the wreck or to understand the preservation mechanics. The team had to prove they could disassemble the site without triggering a secondary catastrophe. The unexploded bombs acted as sentinels, forcing a delay while specialized resources were mobilized. The method fingerprint of this case is defined by this pause. The grid was established, the threat was identified, and the grid was abandoned. The recovery could not proceed until the equation changed. The ordnance had to be rendered safe by explosive ordnance disposal specialists before the forensic work could resume. The site required a sequence of operations where safety engineering cleared the path for archaeology. The decision to walk away in 2002 preserved the integrity of the team, but it left the central question unanswered. The evidence remained under the water, with the hazard sitting on top of it like a lock. And even with that lock removed, the mission would still return to the original constraint: a sealed bowl of water and mud on a mountain ridge, hiding delicate evidence in a slurry that could not be seen, touched, or mapped until the environment itself was brought under control. The solution to the problem of the submerged crater lies in the selection of the correct mechanical force. In 1961, the Royal Australian Air Force attempted to recover the crew using manual labor and basic tools. They failed because they could not overcome the hydrostatic pressure of the water and the inflow of groundwater. The water level remained static at 13 feet, defeating their efforts to reach the fuselage. The modern recovery team approached the site with a different strategy. They did not fight the water, they used it as a tool. This process is often described as a water-managed excavation. To access what lay beneath, the team used pumps to control the water level inside the bowl, not simply to dry the site, but to keep the sediment workable. Instead of tearing into the bottom with heavy machinery, sediment was moved in controlled batches and washed through mesh screens so that fine silt could be separated from larger fragments. In broad terms, it was a slow, methodical way to peel back the crater's layers while protecting fragile evidence. It is a slow, rhythmic process. The pumps maintain the water level just below the active working surface, keeping the sediment manageable. As the screens reveal the contents of the crater, the team encounters the material evidence of the loss. In this specific case, accounts of the recovery described unusually preserved biological material, sometimes referred to as wet remains, consistent with prolonged waterlogged burial. The recovery of biological evidence triggers a strict legal and procedural protocol known as the chain of custody. This is the documentation system that tracks a piece of evidence from the moment it is lifted from the earth to the moment it arrives in the laboratory. In a forensic recovery, the physical location of a find is just as important as the object itself. Every bone fragment or personal effect is tagged with its grid coordinate, date of recovery, and the name of the excavator. The chain of custody acts as a legal seal. It proves that the evidence has not been tampered with, substituted, or contaminated during transport. For the crew of the Happy Legend, this process was critical. The remains were commingled, meaning the individuals were not found in discrete, separate burials, but were mixed together by the dynamics of the crash. To separate them later, the laboratory requires absolute certainty about where each fragment was found relative to the others and relative to the crew stations in the aircraft. The preservation of the wet remains added a logistical constraint to the chain of custody. These elements could not simply be bagged and boxed. They required temperature-controlled environments to prevent rapid decomposition once exposed to the oxygen in the atmosphere. The team had to simulate the protective environment of the crater during the transport phase. By the end of the deployment, the crater had been drained, screened, and mapped. The water that had blocked access in 1961 was removed, and the sediment had been processed. The recovery team successfully extracted the contents of the geological trap. They left the site with a collection of sealed cases, each tagged and logged. The physical recovery was complete, but the identity of the remains was not yet established. The mud had yielded the raw material, but it offered no names. The transition of the evidence from the Owen Stanley Range to the sterile environment of the laboratory marks a fundamental shift in the investigation. At this stage, the recovery team has verified the location and secured the physical contents of the site. However, the central objective remains unfulfilled. The containers arriving at the facility hold the raw data required to answer the primary question, but they do not yet provide the answer itself. The process moves from a logistical operation driven by pumps and excavation grids to a forensic inquiry driven by biological sorting. The inventory recovered from the crater represents a complex data set. The wet screening process successfully separated the aircraft structure from the human element, but the result is not a simple set of 7 distinct remains. The violent dynamics of the impact, followed by 67 years of sediment shifting within the fluid environment of the depression, resulted in a commingled state. The 7 crew members were not found in discrete, identifiable stations. Instead, the osseous material, the skeletal remains, was mixed together in the mud layer. This creates a specific procedural challenge. The laboratory receives a collection of fragments that must be sorted back into individual biological profiles. The total number of individuals on the manifest is 7. This number acts as the control variable for the inventory. The forensic anthropologists must account for every fragment and determine if the biological evidence supports the historical claim of 7 occupants. The condition of this evidence is the defining variable for the identification path. Because of the anaerobic preservation within the water-filled crater, the material did not degrade to the same extent as it would have on the surface. The recovery yielded wet remains, or soft tissue that retained its cellular integrity due to the lack of oxygen. This preservation offers a higher probability of successful genetic sequencing compared to dry, calcified bone found in aerobic crash sites. The mud that made the recovery so difficult physically has chemically protected the identity of the crew. Alongside the biological material, the team recovered a significant volume of material evidence. This category includes non-biological items that provide context and presumptive identification. In the case of the Happy Legend, the screens captured personal effects, flight gear, and identification tags. These items are critical for establishing the presence of specific individuals at the time of the crash. A dog tag found in the same grid square as a set of remains suggests an identity, but in a commingled high-energy site, it does not prove it. The force of the explosion can separate a crew member from their equipment. Therefore, material evidence serves as a guide, but not a conclusion. The pivot point in this chapter is the selection of the identification methodology. The team cannot rely on visual recognition or simple association. The complexity of the commingled remains forces the investigation to rely on microscopic and chemical analysis. The outcome depends on whether the preserved tissue can yield viable DNA sequences and whether those sequences can be matched to surviving maternal relatives of the 7 crew members. The investigation now rests on a comparison between the physical reality on the table and the historical records of the crew. The recovery phase proved that the aircraft is in custody. The preservation phase proved that the biology is intact. The final hurdle is to resolve the mixture. The laboratory must deconstruct the collective loss of the crew and reconstruct the individual identities of the men. The mud has been washed away, but the separation of 7 distinct genetic lines from a single mass of evidence requires a level of precision that exceeds the capabilities of the field team. The mathematical limit of the investigation is the number 7. The laboratory process is designed to convert the commingled evidence recovered from the crater into 7 distinct legal identities. This is the domain of forensic identification. It is not a subjective process of recognition, but a statistical process of exclusion and matching. To achieve a positive identification, the forensic anthropologists must align three independent data sets: the historical manifest, the biological profile derived from the skeletal structure, and the genetic sequence extracted from the tissue. The preserved remains provided the critical data key. Because the site yielded recoverable biological material, the laboratory was able to extract DNA, including mitochondrial DNA, and compare it to reference samples from maternal line relatives. By overlapping sequences from the crater with the family reference data, analysts could reach identification conclusions that met the required standard for official accounting and documentation. This process yielded a definitive result. The science confirmed the presence of all 7 men listed on the flight orders of December 5, 1942. The institutional ambiguity of missing in action was replaced by the forensic certainty of accounted for. While the biological evidence confirmed the crew, the material evidence helped confirm the machine. Among the artifacts screened from the sediment was a section of the aircraft's aluminum skin bearing painted markings. Later descriptions report that the nickname was still legible in part, at least the word happy, providing a tangible link between the crater and the aircraft long associated with that name. It is a powerful anchor for the story, even as investigators still rely on serial number documentation and laboratory accounting to make the case airtight. A public milestone came on November 17, 2009, when a ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery for the crew of the Happy Legend. Contemporary reporting described 2 caskets in the procession, one carrying the commingled human remains and a second bearing recovered personal effects and artifacts from the site. The moment closed a long chapter for the families, even as individual burial timelines could differ within the broader accounting story. The recovery of the Happy Legend serves as a case study in the evolution of aviation archaeology. In 1943, the site was a tactical impossibility. In 1961, it remained a logistical dead end against a water-filled crater. In the modern era, recoveries began in 2001, with additional recoveries reported in 2005, as resources and methods finally caught up with the physics of the crash site. The team had to contend with the water barrier, reported live ordnance hazards, and the complexity of commingled remains to close the file. The crater in New Guinea remains, but it is no longer a trap. The evidence it held has moved from mud and rumor into documented record.